Hello, everyone. So, we're going to start this week off by talking about production. So, just to provide a brief outline, um, we're going to start with kind of a mainstream view of production that you may be pretty familiar with. We're going to move that to a discussion of kind of technology and social organization, kind of talking about where production functions come from. We're going to have a little side discussion on post-industrialism and development, and then finally we're going to wrap it all up by talking about global value chains, which I think will nicely complement earlier discussions of globalization. So, how most economists think about production is in the framework of a production function, right? So there is a certain combination of inputs that will produce a certain output. And those inputs, I've kept it very simple here with just capital and labor, but we could define that with however many input commodities you want. And they're just connected by some mathematical relationship that's defined by the technology of production. But there's obviously a lot more going on in the world of production. So first, let's think about technology itself. So technology is what defines the production function, and social organization is another dimension of how work is organized and that might have an effect on what the production function is. So starting with technology. Technology has clearly advanced and clearly resulted in immensely increased productivity and living standards. We can think of it as doing kind of more with the available resources we have, but it also brings more resources into use. So, for instance, in I believe it was the 1970s, the Club of Rome supposed that the Earth would be out of oil by, I believe, the late 90s or early 2000s. And given the technology of oil extraction at the time, they were correct. All of the accessible oil reserves would have been depleted. But technology for extracting oil advanced, and then more and more oil became available for extraction. And then the legal structure is also important, right? So patents act as incentives for people to innovate. And we also, say, place limits on certain types of innovation to prevent people from doing things that we decide are socially destructive or immoral or what have you. But so the legal structure kind of sets what is permissible and sets up incentive structures for people or organizations to innovate. Speaking of organizations, most technological advancement today doesn't really occur because of, some individual in a workshop toiling away until they make a better light bulb or whatever. These come from large institutions, public or private, that have these network of supporting institutions, right? So some classic examples here would be like the national laboratories, but also Bell Labs as a private example. And so each of these kind of entities were not just one person, but groups of people working together towards specific goals. Taking a bit more broad view, modern mass production wouldn't be possible without compulsory education, which is a social policy in many ways, right? And so we have to kind of set up the preconditions that would allow certain technological advancements to be useful, right? So if you have all of the machinery to construct an assembly line, that does you little good if all of the available workers are unable to do basic math or read to work on your assembly line. And so these social systems become very important. Turning to social organization, let's kind of discuss kind of the evolution of social organization of work and capitalism. In kind of a pre-capital state, you've got, at least in a commodity producing framework. You've got self-directed production by artisans, right? They may have apprentices or helpers, but the presumption is that those helpers or apprentices will become masters themselves, right? So there's this kind of strict control on the supply of labor, and largely artisans are just directing their own productive activities. There isn't really a strict hierarchy beyond the master-apprentice hierarchy. In capitalism, you get owners and bosses. And so initially, this is a very arm's length thing with a length transaction with the putting out system. But eventually, as the machinery that workers need to produce things competitively becomes more and more expensive, the capitalist doesn't want to just leave that with the worker. So instead, they bring the workers together in a workshop. And so we're still talking about individual workers working individually, but collectively in a workshop where the boss can observe and can prevent the worker from idling the machine or damaging the machine. The next kind of evolutionary step here is to divide up work into smaller and smaller chunks in an assembly line, right? So this kind of linking up of workers doing smaller and smaller tasks speeds up production. It also makes it easier to surveil on workers and enforce labor. And then kind of the next step in this was scientific management or Taylorism. So in this example, in this kind of framework, you wanted to break down tasks as small as possible, and you wanted to find ways to optimize them. And so it was this presumption that management and these production engineers would know better than the individual workers how to do their jobs. And so workers lost a lot of autonomy. Now, Taylorism can create some problems for production. But before we talk about that, this image here is an example of kind of the method of the Taylorism. So here you've got a long exposure photography of a worker assembling some object, and they tied lights to the ends of the worker's fingers to track the movements. And so they used this long exposure photography to find ways that the worker was moving inefficiently so they could make the motions shorter or just simply more efficient. Now, this kind of like strong overbearing management can create problems, though. So, for instance, a great historical example, I forget the book it's in, but it's like a memoir of a auto assembly line worker that was working in Detroit at the height of kind of Taylorism. And so there was a big kind of tirade from the foreman about everyone needs to work their job description. You need to work your station and you need to do exactly what your job description is. And so this guy's job description was to take a door and to affix that door to the car. And so he said, do this specifically, and I swear if you stop the line, we will fire you. And so comes along, and it's clear that the wrong doors are being fed to this worker to attach to the cars. But because of the incentive structure and the antagonistic management relations of the time, he simply just bolted the wrong doors onto hundreds and hundreds of cars, and off they went. And this kind of overbearing management style is what in some part led to kind of the downfall of American auto manufacturing in, say, the late 80s or in the late 70s and early 80s. And what kind of displaced it, both in the U.S., is a system that developed in Japan, and that is the team system. In the team system, workers have more input and have a more collaborative relationship with their foreman. So, for instance, workers are encouraged to find ways to improve the productive process and to bring that to the attention of management. Also, every worker has the ability to stop the assembly line if something is going wrong. And so there's not this like enforcement of the pace of labor to the rhythm of the machine. The worker has more input. And under this kind of management style is so using this sort of management style is one way that Japanese auto manufacturers were able to improve quality far and beyond what American auto manufacturers could. And the team system has kind of spread throughout many manufacturing industries since. So, changing gears for a bit, let's talk about development. So, development has typically occurred through industrialization. Some industries are more industrializable than others, like agriculture and service. It's a little harder to industrialize than, say, making washing machines. And more and more sustainability concerns, right, are paramount. So you may not be able to industrialize production of something that is extremely resource intensive, just simply because it may not, a decade down the road, you may not be able to continue to produce it. In the developed world, deindustrialization has kind of occurred, at least in value terms. Developed economies have become more reliant on services and intellectual property for their economic output. And so this has led to the idea that some developing economies could simply skip industrialization and jump directly to a service-based and knowledge-based economy. But industrialization has important spillover benefits. It creates knowledge bases, and it creates networks that we've talked about previously in the course, and kind of ancillary industries that are really important for economies to develop. And so some of the countries that have tried to skip industrialism and go straight to a service knowledge-based economy, such as India, have not been as successful as those countries that have taken the more traditional industrial path. So industrialization is still an important part of development, at least it seems so. All right. So finally, let's talk about global value chains. So industrialization in these developing nations that are taking a more, industrial path to development, they're often not homegrown. So as the global economy is becoming increasingly integrated, a lot of times firms in the developed countries may shed many functions and focus on core competencies, and then they may invest in other firms or create their own subsidiaries in other countries. And we've discussed this already. So we've got firms in the developed world, which we'll call core firms. And then we have firms that are contracting with them in the developed world, which we'll call peripheral firms. And so these aren't pure market-based transactions, right? So it's not like Apple, puts out bids to make the next iPhone, and then whoever gives the best bid makes it, right? That's not how it works. They have repeated interactions with the same suppliers, the same manufacturers over and over again. And so because of that, there's some power involved. But before we get into the power of it, global value chains involve just linking together a bunch of activities, right? So the design of products, the marketing of products, these are things that typically happen in, say, the core countries, while raw material gathering and actual production often take place in more peripheral countries with peripheral firms. It's important to note that design and marketing are higher margin activities than raw material gathering or production, generally speaking, right? So activities in the core generate higher rates of profit. Excess profits, right? Because these are based in things like branded technology, which are either protected by patents or copyright, and so they are essentially barriers to entry. So, for instance, you can't have a firm just kind of start from zero in the developing world and start cranking out, laptops that people will buy because there's certain brand recognition, right? Like people want ThinkPads and Apple laptops. So there's all these barriers of entry with both technology and branding. So with these excess profits that the core countries get, they can selectively distribute those profits somewhere else down the chain in the developing world to influence the behavior of other actors. So there, some examples of this would be, for instance, Walmart used kind of paying a premium above most other stores that were contracting in the developing world for the production of clothing. They'd pay a premium over their competitors, and in exchange for that premium, their suppliers had to agree not to employ child labor. And so this is one way that firms' actions are kind of affected by the moral suasion of their consumers in the developed world and can improve conditions for workers in the developing world. And this is the idea of governance, right? That we can, not just governments, but also firms and consumer organizations can kind of influence behavior along the chain by essentially forcing distribution of these excess profits. Another really prominent example is the Mugged report by Oxfam that was looking at coffee supply chains. And so in that report, they showed that most coffee growers were actually operating at a loss and living very, very impoverished existences for a while. And a lot of the excess profits were getting caught up at the roaster level and at the big multinational level. And so consumer organizations, kind of informed by this report, were formed, and you get certain things like fair trade coffee labeling. And this was actually very successful in improving the lives of many coffee growers. So this is another example of kind of global value chain governance. There is some thought that as the IT revolution spreads and there's further deregulation of international markets, there may be less need for formal governance of global value chains, and it may become more and more like this kind of arm's length market transaction. Another aspect to this is the idea of upgrading, in that countries can further develop by moving into higher value activities, right? So you start making kind of, take the example of China, right? So you start making small consumer electronics, you start making these for other firms who are based in the developed world, and then eventually you kind of upgrade your own productive process, and so you've got Huawei and Xiaomi, right? So they moved up to the higher value chain of marketing, or the higher value steps on the chain of marketing and design, and because of that, they're able to capture additional profits. There's a few different ways that countries can upgrade. They can move to higher value product lines. They can improve their productive process. They can kind of gobble up other steps along the chain, or they can move into new sectors that are kind of complementary to sectors they've already been developing their productive capabilities in. So global value chains are just one way that we can think of the globalization of trade in a more kind of production-oriented way, rather than a pure trade-oriented way. So just wrapping things up, production is far more than a production function. Technology and social organization help to define the production function, and social organization of production need not be strictly hierarchical and antagonistic, right? So like the Japanese auto manufacturers with their team system did better than kind of the more hierarchical approach that was taken in the US around the same time. Industrialization still is really important for development, even as the developed world is getting more and more kind of service-based, at least in value terms. And finally, as globalization kind of continues, it's more and more important to look inside the black box of production and think about why conditions for certain workers along the chain are worse than other workers along the chain, and how that might be improved through governance and upgrading.